The night my husband died, the hospital called me before his phone stopped ringing. I remember that detail more clearly than anything else. The nurse's voice was calm, practiced, almost too gentle, and for a few seconds I stood in my kitchen with one hand on the edge of the counter, listening to words that should have shattered me. Richard Harper, my husband of 43 years, was gone. At 68, I thought I understood grief. I had buried my parents. I had sat beside friends in church pews and watched their hands tremble over folded tissues. I knew sorrow had a sound. I knew it had a weight. What I did not know, not until that night, was that betrayal could arrive wearing the same black coat. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. Richard had left 2 hours earlier in his navy blazer, saying he had a late meeting with a financial advisor across town. He had kissed the air near my cheek, not quite touching me, and reached for his keys with the distracted impatience that had become so common in recent years. I had noticed it, of course. Women my age notice everything. We simply learn not to announce it too soon. So when the nurse asked whether I could come identify personal belongings in the morning, I said yes in a voice so steady it startled even me. Then I set the phone down and looked at his coffee cup still sitting beside the sink. There was half an inch of cold coffee left in it. A brown ring on white porcelain. Such an ordinary thing. Such a cruel thing, too. I might have stood there all night if his cell phone had not lit up on the hallway table. He had forgotten it for once. Richard never forgot his phone. The screen glowed in the dark like a small accusation, and I walked toward it slowly, already feeling something inside me turn sharp and cold. One message sat at the top of the screen from a name I had never seen before, though somehow I knew exactly who she was. Vanessa. Her words were brief, impatient, intimate in the way only familiarity can be. Are you still coming? I stared at that sentence until the letters blurred. No poetry. No romance. Just expectation. Just routine. The kind built over time. In that moment, the room did not spin and I did not collapse. I simply understood. My husband had not died on the way to a meeting. He had died on the way to another woman. The realization settled over me with the slow certainty of winter frost. All at once, the past few years rearranged themselves into something ugly but coherent. The late dinners. The new cologne. The way he had begun speaking to me like a person standing in the doorway of his life instead of at the center of it. I picked up his phone, turned off the screen, and placed it face down on the table. Then I walked to the living room and sat in my favorite chair beneath the lamp Richard always said was too dim for reading. I folded my hands in my lap and listened to the clock. He had left me grief, yes. But before the night was over, he had also left me proof. The next morning arrived pale and cold, the kind of early light that makes every room look unfamiliar. I did not sleep. I sat in the living room until dawn with Richard's phone on the side table beside me, as if it were some small machine still quietly producing answers. By 6 o'clock, I rose, made coffee, and moved through the kitchen with the same careful motions I had used for decades. Spoon, mug, cream. The ordinary rituals steadied me. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the windows over the sink. Our house, the one we had lived in for 37 years, felt less like a home that morning and more like a stage after the actors had gone. His jacket was still hanging by the front door. His reading glasses still rested on the end table in the den. Everywhere I looked, Richard remained. And yet the man I had shared a life with had somehow already disappeared long before the hospital ever called. I drove to St. Catherine's Medical Center just after 7, the windshield wipers beating a slow rhythm across the glass. The parking garage smelled faintly of damp concrete and motor oil. Inside, the hallways were overly warm, too bright, lined with polished floors and quiet people speaking in voices meant not to disturb grief. A young nurse led me to a small private room and handed me a clear plastic bag containing Richard's wallet, watch, wedding band, and car keys. I thanked her, because women of my generation thank people even while our lives are splitting open. His watch had stopped at 8:14. I stared at it for a long moment, then placed the bag in my purse with hands that did not shake until I reached the elevator. On the ride down, I opened his wallet. It was something I would once have considered disrespectful, but respect had changed shape overnight. Tucked behind his driver's license was a valet ticket from the Marlowe House, a boutique hotel downtown with a rooftop bar and quiet rooms often recommended for weekend anniversaries and business travelers. Richard and I had never been there. The ticket was dated 3 weeks earlier. I slipped it back where I found it and closed the wallet. By the time I reached the car, the rain had steadied, and I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Then I took out his phone. There were more messages from Vanessa now. I read them all in silence. No dramatic declarations. No grand confessions. Just the easy rhythm of a connection that had clearly not begun yesterday. Dinner reservations. Changed plans. One message about a blue tie she liked on him. Another asking whether he had spoken to me yet. That one I read twice. Spoken to me about what? I searched his email next. I found restaurant confirmations, hotel receipts, and a thread about a property consultation I had never heard of, involving a condominium on the north side of the city. Small things on their own. Together, they formed a second life. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let my eyes close, not because I was overcome, but because I needed one honest second before I stood back up inside myself. When I lifted my head again, I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror. My silver hair was still pinned neatly in place. My lipstick had faded. My face looked older than it had yesterday. Harder, too. I started the car and drove home through the rain with Richard's secrets in my purse and a strange new certainty settling into my bones. Whatever else I had lost, I would not lose the truth. By the time I reached the house, the rain had thinned to a fine gray mist, the kind that clings to the windows and makes the world look blurred around the edges. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine off, listening to the soft ticking sound a car makes after a long drive. Then I gathered Richard's watch, wallet, ring, and phone and carried them inside like evidence from a life I no longer recognized. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and the white lilies a neighbor had left on the porch that morning. Sympathy had already begun arriving, neat and fragrant and useless. I set everything on the dining room table, the same table where we had hosted Thanksgiving dinners and birthday cakes and quiet Sunday breakfasts when the world still seemed smaller and kinder. Now it looked like a place for sorting facts. I took off my coat, hung it carefully in the hall closet, and began opening drawers. Not in a frantic way. Not like someone looking for scandal. More like a woman finally giving herself permission to see what had always been there. Richard kept a small filing cabinet in the study, locked most of the time, though I knew where he hid the key. Inside were folders marked in his neat handwriting. Taxes, insurance, household records, investment summaries. Beneath those, tucked farther back than the others, was a plain manila file with no label at all. I opened it and found copies of bank statements, a brochure for a luxury condominium development on the north side of Chicago, and a printed email confirmation for a consultation with a real estate attorney. Vanessa Cole's name appeared once in the papers, not as a buyer, but as an emergency contact on an inquiry form. I stared at that line until my eyes burned. Not because it surprised me anymore, but because of how casually it had been entered, as if my absence from his future had already been decided. I carried the file to the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat at the table with the rain-speckled window over my shoulder. The house felt very still. Too still. I could hear the old refrigerator hum, the baseboard heat clicking on, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the block. Every familiar sound seemed sharper, as though betrayal had tuned my hearing. Around noon, the doorbell rang. It was Diane Brooks from 3 houses down, holding a covered casserole and wearing the solemn expression people reserve for funerals and bad diagnoses. Diane and I had never been close friends, but we had lived on the same street for nearly 20 years, close enough to wave across flower beds and exchange Christmas cards. I invited her in. She set the dish on the counter and looked at me with an uneasy kindness that told me she had not come only to be polite. We sat in the den, and after a few brittle minutes of weather talk and sympathy, she folded her hands tightly in her lap and said there was something she felt I deserved to know. Her voice trembled when she told me she had seen Richard more than once over the past few months with a woman downtown. Not at church dinners or business lunches. Not in any way that could be explained away. She said she almost convinced herself she was mistaken until she saw them again outside the Marlowe house just last Thursday. He had his hand at the small of her back. She looked comfortable there. Familiar. Diane's cheeks turned pink as she spoke, embarrassed on his behalf, perhaps even on mine. I thanked her for telling me, and I meant it. because by then I understood that grief had become a hallway leading to a locked room, and one by one, people were beginning to hand me the keys. After Diane left, I carried her untouched casserole to the refrigerator and stood there for a moment with the cold air spilling over my hands. I should have felt shocked. Instead, I felt confirmed. There is a difference, and women who have been married a long time understand it better than anyone. Shock comes when something arrives from nowhere. Confirmation comes when the truth finally has the decency to stop hiding. I closed the refrigerator door and returned to the study with Richard's papers tucked beneath my arm. Outside, the mist had cleared, leaving the backyard washed clean and strangely bright. The maple tree near the fence swayed in a mild afternoon wind, and for one absurd second I thought about how Richard used to complain every fall when the leaves clogged the gutters. That was the cruelty of betrayal. Even after the illusion cracked, memory kept offering up these ordinary domestic details, as if a good marriage might still be reconstructed from routines and weather and long habit. I sat at his desk and opened the center drawer. Inside were the things a careful man always keeps close: postage stamps, reading glasses, spare batteries, a leather-bound planner. I flipped through the pages and found several appointments marked only with initials or single words. VC lunch. North Side, Marlow. One entry from the month before caught my attention more than the others. Keller, 11:30 a.m. Richard had written it in blue ink, underlined once. Martin Keller was not only a respected estate attorney in town. He was also the man who had drafted our wills nearly a decade ago. I leaned back in the chair and let that settle. Affairs are cruel enough on their own, but there was something colder in the idea of paperwork. Meetings, signatures, plans made in calm offices under soft lighting. I called Martin's office before I could talk myself out of it. His assistant answered in a brisk, polished voice and recognized my name immediately. When I told her Richard had passed away the night before, her tone softened at once. She offered condolences, then asked whether I would like to come in later that week to review the documents. Review which documents? I asked. There was a brief pause, the kind that reveals more than words. Estate materials, she said carefully, and a few recent revisions Mr. Harper had requested. I thanked her and scheduled an appointment for Thursday at 10 in the morning. Then I hung up and sat very still. Recent revisions. The words echoed through the room long after the call ended. I thought of every year I had stood beside Richard while he built his career, every dinner I had hosted for clients, every move I had made in service of our life together. I had raised our son, managed our home, remembered birthdays, handled illnesses, stretched budgets in leaner years, and smiled through the rest. I had been partner, audience, witness, and keeper of everything that made him look steady in the world. And somewhere along the way, while I was preserving the life we built, Richard had apparently begun redrawing it without me. I opened the planner again, then his email, then the manila folder with Vanessa's name buried inside. Piece by piece, the shape of it sharpened. This had not been a foolish lapse or a late-in-life confusion. It had structure. It had timing. It had intention. By early evening, the shadows in the study had grown long across the carpet, and I finally stood to turn on the lamp by the bookcase. Its warm pool of light fell over Richard's desk, the planner, the files, the quiet evidence of a man who had assumed he would have more time to rearrange my future without my consent. He had counted on secrecy. He had counted on grief. What he had not counted on was me. Thursday morning arrived clear and cool, with a hard blue sky stretched over the neighborhood and a wind sharp enough to rattle the last dry leaves across the driveway. I dressed with more care than grief usually allows. Cream blouse, navy slacks, pearl earrings Richard bought me on our 25th anniversary, back when gestures still meant what I thought they meant. I wanted no one mistaking me for a woman too broken to understand paperwork. Martin Keller's office sat on the 12th floor of a limestone building downtown, all glass doors and muted carpet and tasteful art chosen to reassure wealthy people that their secrets would be handled discreetly. His receptionist greeted me softly and led me to a conference room with a long walnut table and a silver tray set with coffee cups no one had touched. Martin entered a moment later, gray-haired, polished, his expression composed into professional sorrow. He offered condolences, and I thanked him. Then he sat across from me, folded his hands, and opened a file thick enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. Richard had not only been unfaithful, he had been busy. Over the past 6 months, he had requested revised beneficiary language on 2 investment accounts, explored changes to a life insurance policy, and asked detailed questions about the sale of jointly held assets. Not completed, Martin clarified, but discussed, considered, drafted in preliminary form. Each word landed with its own quiet insult. Richard had been planning a future that depended on removing me from the center of the life we had built together, and he had done it in air-conditioned offices with clean pens and legal stationery. As if betrayal became respectable once it was formatted correctly. I asked Martin one question at a time. Had any documents been signed? A few. Had any been fully executed? Not all. Were there changes involving someone other than family? At that, his eyes shifted just slightly, and he answered with lawyerly caution that one consultation had involved a request to understand how separate property might be established after liquidation of certain marital holdings. Separate property. The phrase was bloodless, clinical, yet I knew exactly what it meant. A condominium on the north side. Funds moved quietly. A woman entered through the side door of my marriage and handed a key before I was even told the lock had been changed. Martin slid several copies toward me, and I read them in silence. Richard had been asking about how quickly joint accounts could be restructured, whether proceeds from a property sale could be redirected before distribution, whether inheritance protections for an adult spouse could be narrowed under certain conditions. Under certain conditions. That was how a 43-year marriage was reduced in the language of men who billed by the hour. I should say that Martin did not look pleased. In fact, there were moments when he seemed embarrassed on Richard's behalf. But embarrassment is a very small offering when you are the wife in the chair across the table. When I finished reading, I placed the papers in a neat stack and looked out the conference room window at the city below. Tiny cars, tiny people, tiny lives, all rushing forward under the illusion that the ground beneath them was stable. Then I turned back to Martin and asked the only question that mattered now. What, exactly, is legally mine? He answered carefully, thoroughly, and with increasing respect as it became clear I was not there to collapse. The house. Significant portions of the investment portfolio. Existing jointly titled holdings. Protection under the current will until any incomplete revisions could be challenged or dismissed. Richard, it seemed, had begun drawing his escape map, but he had not lived long enough to finish erasing me. I gathered the copies, slid them into my leather folder, and stood. Martin rose too, offering to have his office support me through probate and any disputes that might arise. I thanked him and said I would be in touch. On the elevator down, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked exactly like what I was becoming. Not a widow lost in shock. Not a woman begging for answers. A wife who had finally seen the ledger clearly and understood that what Richard had tried to take from me was not only money. It was place. It was dignity. It was history. And now that I knew the scale of it, I intended to collect every last thing he had hoped I would surrender quietly. When I returned home from Martin Keller's office, the house no longer felt like a place where I had been abandoned. It felt like a place where I had been underestimated. That is not the same thing. Abandonment leaves you hollow. Being underestimated leaves you alert. I set my leather folder on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard while the afternoon light stretched across the grass in long golden bars. Somewhere on the next street over, a lawn mower started up. Ordinary sounds continued, as they always do, no matter what has been broken in private. I drank the water slowly, then carried Richard's phone, planner, and the stack of copied documents into the den and cleared a space on the coffee table. If Richard had spent 6 months preparing to redraw my life, then I intended to know every line he had sketched. I began with the phone. I read every message between him and Vanessa again, this time not as a wounded wife, but as a careful witness. The pattern revealed itself quickly. She was not some passing distraction. She knew the names of his business contacts, the details of his travel schedule, his preferences in restaurants. Even the week Martin's office had prepared draft revisions. One message from 2 months earlier stopped me cold. She had written, "Once the condo is settled, we can stop sneaking around and start fresh." Richard's answer was worse because of how calm it was. "Almost there. I am handling Evelyn." I read those 4 words 3 times. Handling Evelyn. As if I were a loose end. as if 43 years of loyalty could be folded, labeled, and placed in a drawer. I set the phone down very carefully and opened the planner again. There were initials I had not understood before, small references that now made sense. VC was obvious. MK for Martin Keller. NS beside 2 lunch appointments. I searched Richard's email and found the answer in an archived thread from his assistant. North Shore Realty. He had been exploring the condominium seriously enough to request floor plans, closing estimates, and parking details. There was even a note about preferred delivery timing for furniture. He had been arranging pieces of a new life while still sleeping beneath my roof. I should tell you that I did not cry then either. Tears are often expected of women my age, as though sorrow must always be visible to be real. But what I felt was not soft enough for tears. It was colder than that. I made a legal pad chart with dates, names, properties, and account references. I highlighted every message tied to money or future plans. I wrote down questions for Martin about transfers, signatures, and who knew what. By early evening, the coffee table looked less like a place for magazines and more like a command center. The strange thing was how calm I felt. Not peaceful. Calm is different. Calm is what comes when confusion finally gives way to structure. Just after 6, my phone rang. It was our son, Daniel, calling from Denver. His voice was thick with grief and flight delays and practical questions about the service. I answered gently. I told him only what he needed to know for now. Come home. We will talk when you get here. After we hung up, I looked around the den at the quiet lamplight, the files, the phone, the neat columns of my handwriting. Richard had built his secret life on the assumption that I would remain the trusting wife until the very end. He was wrong. The trusting wife was gone. In her place sat a woman with proof, a legal pad, and enough composure to let the truth ripen before she served it. Daniel arrived the next afternoon with a carry-on suitcase, a wrinkled blue shirt, and the stunned look of a man who had not yet caught up to his own life. He hugged me hard in the foyer, and for a moment I let myself lean into the familiar shape of my son, the one person in that house who still felt untouched by Richard's choices. He smelled like airport coffee and cold air. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. I made him sit at the kitchen table and eat the chicken soup I had warmed on the stove, because feeding someone is sometimes the only way to keep yourself from saying too much too soon. He asked practical questions between spoonfuls. Had I called the funeral home? Had I chosen a suit? Did I need help contacting the church? I answered each one calmly. Then he looked at me over the rim of his glass and said, very quietly, was Dad unhappy? It was not the question of a child. It was the question of an adult man who had noticed more than I once believed. I folded my napkin in my lap and told him the truth in measured pieces. Your father was not where he said he would be that night. There is more I need to confirm before I say everything. But no, Daniel, your father was not living honestly. He stared at the table for a long time after that. He did not defend Richard. He did not ask me to soften it. He only nodded once, slowly, as if some private suspicion had finally found its name. By evening, word had spread through our circle, and condolence calls began arriving in clusters. Former colleagues, neighbors, 2 of Richard's golf friends. Their voices blurred together in that careful tone people use when they want to sound compassionate without stepping too close to the mess. I thanked them all. I wrote down casseroles and flower deliveries and times for the visitation. I played the part expected of me so well that even I was almost impressed. Then, just after 7, the doorbell rang. Daniel rose to answer it, but I was already standing. Something in me knew before I crossed the foyer. When I opened the door, the woman on the porch wore a camel coat, pearl earrings, and an expression she had probably practiced in her car. Vanessa Cole was prettier than I expected in the way magazine ads are pretty. Polished. Controlled. Her blonde hair was swept into a low knot, and her lipstick was the color of soft roses. She held a bouquet of white orchids wrapped in tissue paper that looked too expensive for grief and too deliberate to be innocent. For one suspended second, we simply looked at each other. Then she said my name as if she had some right to pronounce it gently. Evelyn. I am so sorry. Daniel stepped into the hallway behind me, confusion tightening his face. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask what she was doing there. Instead, I opened the door a little wider and said, how kind of you to come. Her relief was small, but visible. She had expected tears, perhaps anger. Women like Vanessa often mistake restraint for weakness. I led her to the living room, where the late sun was fading into amber across the rug, and invited her to sit. She perched on the edge of the sofa, too careful, too composed. Daniel remained standing. I introduced her as someone who knew Richard through business. She smiled at that, though not comfortably. Then she placed the orchids on the coffee table and said she had been shocked by the news. I believe that part. Shock looks different when your plans die with the man who made them. I sat across from her in my armchair and folded my hands. You and Richard must have known each other well, I said. Her eyes flickered once. Long enough, she answered. The room went very still. Daniel looked from her to me, then back again. And there it was, the first crack she gave me with her own mouth. She had come to test the ground, to see what I knew, to place herself closer to the story before anyone else could move her out of it. But she had stepped into my house too early, and by doing so, she had told me exactly how confident Richard had made her. Vanessa stayed for less than 20 minutes, but that was long enough. Long enough for me to notice the way her eyes moved through the room, pausing on the framed photograph over the mantel, the silver bowl on the sideboard, the antique clock Richard's father had left him. She was not looking at a grieving household. She was measuring territory. Daniel saw it too, though I could tell he had not fully understood who she was yet. He stood near the fireplace with his arms folded, polite but watchful, while I asked Vanessa gentle questions in the same tone I might have used with a distant neighbor from church. How had she known Richard? How long had they worked together? What business had brought her into his orbit? Her answers were polished, but not precise enough. Consulting, mutual contacts, occasional meetings, a project that had grown more personal over time. That last phrase hung in the air between us like perfume you regret noticing. I nodded once and let the silence do what silence does best. People rush to fill it when they are afraid. Vanessa did exactly that. She began speaking more softly, telling me Richard had been under a great deal of stress, that he had felt misunderstood, that the last year had been complicated in ways few people knew. Few people. There it was again, that quiet claim of intimacy. The assumption that she had belonged in corners of my husband's life from which I had been excluded. I kept my expression calm, though inside me something settled into place with the clean finality of a lock turning. Richard had not merely deceived me. He had narrated our marriage to another woman in a way that made her feel entitled to explain him to me in my own living room. Daniel interrupted at last, his voice sharper than before, and asked how exactly she had become so familiar with his father's private feelings. Vanessa blinked, only once, but it was enough. She turned her head toward him and gave a smile too practiced to be sincere. Your father and I had become close through work, she said. We talked. Daniel did not sit down after that. Neither did I. The room had shifted. The pleasantries had thinned out, and everyone could feel it. I rose and crossed to the coffee table, where her orchids sat beside the stack of sympathy cards from people who had at least understood the correct boundaries. Then I picked up Richard's phone from the side table and held it lightly in one hand. Vanessa's face changed before I even spoke. Not dramatically, just a tiny tightening around the mouth, a stillness in the shoulders. I asked her whether she had been expecting him the night he died. She opened her lips, then closed them again. Daniel looked at me as if the floor had tilted beneath him. I did not rescue anyone from that moment. I simply placed the phone on the table, screen facing upward, and said that some questions were best answered before the visitation, not after. Vanessa stood then, smoothing her coat with both hands, her poise returning in thin, careful layers. She said she did not want to upset the family. Family. That word nearly made me smile. I walked her to the front door myself. On the porch, the evening air had turned cool, and the first porch lights on the street were beginning to glow. Before she stepped away, I told her that Richard had left many things unfinished, and that unfinished things had a way of becoming public when people pushed too quickly. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time I saw something honest there. Not sorrow, not love, fear. She went down the front steps without another word. When I closed the door, Daniel was still standing in the hallway, pale and silent. He asked me, very carefully, who she really was. I looked at my son, at the man grief was forcing him to become in real time, and I answered with the truth I could no longer postpone. She was the woman your father was on his way to see that night. Daniel stared at me as if he had been struck by cold air. Then he sat down heavily on the bench by the wall and covered his mouth with one hand. I did not touch him. Some revelations have to reach a person without interruption. I only stood there in the warm light of the foyer and understood that the next part would not be quiet. The truth had already crossed the threshold. Now it only needed a room big enough to be heard. The visitation was held on Sunday afternoon at a funeral home with beige walls, soft carpet, and the kind of silence that never feels entirely natural. People came in dark coats and careful voices, carrying flowers, casseroles, and the polished versions of memory that follow a death before the truth has had time to breathe. I stood near the front of the room beside Richard's photograph, wearing black wool and a strand of pearls, accepting condolences with a composure that made several people squeeze my hand, as if they mistook restraint for fragility. Daniel stayed close, greeting relatives, thanking neighbors, and moving through the room with the stiff, deliberate posture of a man still trying to reconcile the father he had loved with the man he had only just begun to see clearly. I had spent the previous evening making 3 calls. One to Martin Keller, one to the funeral director, and one, finally, to Vanessa. I told her there were matters concerning Richard's unfinished affairs that needed to be handled in a proper setting, in the presence of those most affected. She arrived 20 minutes into the visitation, dressed in charcoal gray, her face composed but noticeably paler than it had been on my porch. A few heads turned. She had that kind of presence, the kind women cultivate when they are used to being looked at and have not yet learned that attention and acceptance are not the same thing. I watched her pause just inside the doorway as though deciding how boldly she could claim space in a room built around my husband's name. Then Martin stepped forward before she could drift any farther and quietly asked her to join us in the family lounge off the main hall. Daniel looked at me. I nodded once. We went in together. The room was small, private, and furnished with overstuffed chairs no one ever sat in comfortably. On the table between us, Martin laid out a slim folder and Richard's phone. Vanessa took one look at both and crossed her legs more tightly. Martin did not waste words. He stated that Richard Harper had been en route to a personal meeting unrelated to business on the night of his death, that evidence recovered from his phone and records showed an ongoing intimate relationship and a series of attempted legal and financial moves that were incomplete at the time of his passing. Daniel went completely still. Vanessa opened her mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to salvage something, but Martin continued in the same measured tone, explaining that no property, account, or future claim connected to Richard's unfinished arrangements would be recognized outside the lawful estate. Then he placed copies of the relevant messages and preliminary documents on the table. Vanessa did not touch them. She only stared. I sat across from her and folded my gloves in my lap. There are moments in life when anger would be too small. This was one of them. So I did not raise my voice. I told her that Richard had spoken of managing me as though I were an inconvenience to be resolved before his new life could begin. I told her that he had underestimated the woman who built the life he was so eager to abandon. And I told her that whatever fantasy had existed between them, it had ended the moment the truth entered the room with legal paperwork attached. Daniel turned then and looked at her not with fury, but with something far colder and more final than that. Disgust has a very clean face when it is deserved. Vanessa stood first, one hand trembling just enough to betray what remained of her confidence. She said she had loved him. I almost pitied her for choosing that word in front of me. Loved him. Perhaps she had. But love that grows in secrecy and feeds on another woman's erasure is not love I recognize. She left without taking the orchids she had once brought to my house. Martin gathered the papers. Daniel sat down heavily and pressed both hands to his knees, breathing like a man who had just set down a weight too ugly to keep carrying. Later, when the visitation ended and the last murmured sympathy had faded into the parking lot, I returned home alone. The house was quiet, but no longer haunted. Richard's clothes still hung in the closet. His books still lined the shelves. His watch still sat in the drawer where I had placed it after the hospital. Yet something essential had shifted. He had imagined he could leave me with confusion, shame, and loose ends. Instead, he left me the evidence of exactly who he had become. In the weeks that followed, I kept the house, secured the accounts, and let Martin handle every unfinished attempt Richard had made to rearrange my future behind my back. But the real victory was not financial, though I made certain of that too. The real victory was quieter. I stopped protecting the image of a man who had stopped protecting me. I sold the condominium plans back to silence, boxed up the lies with the rest of his private papers, and began deciding what my life would look like when it belonged only to me. Some mornings I still miss the version of Richard I once believed in. Grief is not tidy, and memory can be generous long after truth has withdrawn its blessing. But I do not miss the confusion. I do not miss the waiting. And I do not miss the woman I was when I still thought loyalty would always be returned in kind. He died on his way to a lie. I stayed, faced the truth, and walked away with everything that was mine.